support for what Putin is doing is dying within Russia. I think a lot of what, before this war started, I knew a lot of Russians living in London. They're desperate about Putin. They absolutely detest him and can't wait for him to go. I just wish we were doing more at a government level to engage with the oligarchs who are now living in Dubai. There's a lot of them there. They're powerful and influential within Russia. I mean, I wish we hadn't kicked Abramovich out of the UK, because he's proved to be a kingmaker in Russia. He was close to Putin. I think if we treated him a bit better, perhaps we could have got a negotiated settlement that would ultimately pave the way for a more pro-Western government in Moscow. And I think so. Another point to make here is that, a lot of ordinary Russian people have suffered enormously because of what Putin has done to them, their families, and to their children who've been deployed there, who did not want this war, who did not agree with it, and they've been silenced. So, once this war is over, we will have to engage with Russia again. And that's very important because, Russia is going to be a key trading partner for Europe in the future.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine with Nicholas Drummond. Nicholas is a former army officer and specialist in land warfare. He has 20 years' experience in the defence industry and is the UK strategic advisor on the British Army's newest all-terrain armoured transport vehicle, the Boxer. He's also a respected defence analyst and strategic consultant. Nicholas, welcome back to Frontline.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
First of all, as we enter the winter months, I wonder if you could just give us your assessment of where we are in the war now.
So I think the first disappointing thing to say is that the Ukrainian summer offensive did not lead to much. Very bold attempts to try and break through the Russian line, but it was much thicker, deeper, and harder to penetrate than anyone imagined. And in reality, Ukraine just did not have the mass and concentration of forces that it needed to do that. It was attacking at platoon and company level, sometimes battalion level, when it really needed to be attacking at brigade and divisional level. And that's what it will look to do next year. So with that in mind, we've settled in for another period of stalemate as winter weather settles in Ukraine, and that will restrict movement. The soil in Ukraine is very fertile, and it's a very fine soil. And when it gets wet, it literally becomes like a thick soup, like mud, that is impenetrable by any kind of vehicle, wheeled or tracks for that matter. So that's where we are.
Do you think, therefore, Nicholas, it's unlikely we're going to see any major Ukrainian advance until April at the earliest?
That would be my assessment. I think there will be commando-type activities, dropping troops behind enemy lines to cause confusion. We'll see artillery engagements trying to target Russian logistics, supply points, and taking out headquarters and any concentrations of Russian troops. But I don't think we'll see the large-style offensive that we saw over the summer that they tried to prosecute and failed.
And yet, Russia has not made any significant progress either. It continues to launch assaults on places like Avdiivka, not with much success so far. And interestingly, according to the MOD, Russia has been forced to move several air defence systems from Kaliningrad to the front line in Ukraine. What's the significance of that? Does that tell us something about the weakness of Russia's air defences?
Well, a lot of Ukraine has been very clever in targeting Russian air defences. And I think that the move from Kaliningrad really reflects the fact that F-16s will be arriving in Ukraine soon and in force. And when they do, Ukraine should hopefully gain air superiority on the ground and in the air. And that will enable much greater freedom of movement. I'm looking forward to that happening. And in order to respond to that, the Russians will need to have air defense systems in place. And the fact that they're moving systems in from elsewhere, it tells you how serious the situation is for them.
It's also interesting if you read some of the Russian military bloggers, who of course come from an ultranationalist perspective, but they're increasingly critical of the way the war is being fought, both in terms of the casualties, but also pointing out some of the issues with morale. It was interesting, the Institute for the Study of War saying only in the last few days that the apparent Russian failure to establish a cohesive command structure among forces defending on the east bank of Kherson Oblast continues to degrade Russian morale and combat capabilities. The Ukrainian General Staff have reported that elements of the Black Sea Fleet operating near Krinky are refusing to conduct assaults on the Ukrainian positions due to a lack of artillery coordination. That does suggest that Russia have some serious issues when it comes to morale on the front line.
Yeah, I mean, we're definitely talking about the moral component of war. Ukrainian troops are fighting for their lives. They're fighting for the existence of their country. So they are completely motivated to defend their homeland. And that will continue even though they're exhausted. But, they are inflicting enormous casualties on Russia. And quite rightly, the Russian troops on the ground saying, why are we doing this? What is the point of this? And so you've got those two opposite viewpoints. And that moral component that Ukraine forces have gives them a huge advantage over Russia. And so that every success that Ukraine achieves gives them greater confidence. Every loss that Russia sustains reduces their confidence and their belief in the fact that they can win this. So absolutely.
I mean, are the Russian military bloggers right to point out that some of the Kremlin's tactics have been wrong? I mean, they've been saying things like, well, why are you positioning troops within easy reach of a HIMARS rocket attack, for instance?
Yeah, we throughout this campaign, we've seen very poor tactics on behalf of the Russians from the beginning. And I think what's becoming more apparent is that Ukraine has become more effective at targeting Russian systems and units on the ground using HIMARS. We believe they've got the tactical missile system from the US Army, which is a much longer range, 300-kilometer range versus the 70 kilometers of the regular HIMARS rocket. So they can launch surprise attacks at much longer range. And of course, they've been using long-range French and UK missiles. And so that's been very effective too. So the Ukrainians are constantly able to wrong-foot the Russians. And of course, I think part of it is that we are intercepting Russian communications very effectively. So we're able to tell the Ukrainians what the Russians are doing. And so the Russians think that it's bad tactics, but it actually is more likely it's good targeting on Ukraine's behalf.
I suppose the one advantage Russia has, crucially over Ukraine, is a far bigger population, and Vladimir Putin appears to show a complete disregard for human life and the casualty rate among Russian forces, although we're now hearing that Moscow is looking at ways to coerce migrants to fight on the front line for Russia. Is that a sign of Putin's increasing desperation?
Yeah, he's going to have to really scrape the barrel. Ordinary Russians do not want to get involved in this war. And there's been a huge exodus of young men of a certain age, who are qualified and well educated. They've gone to Europe, they've gone to America, wherever they can go to. And so yes, it's becoming increasingly difficult to recruit people. And last year we saw recruit centres being burnt down with all the records destroyed. So they don't know how to find people to fill the ranks. So yes, Putin is desperate, and yes, he's completely callous in his regard for his own people. He figures Russia's got a population of 140 million. Ukraine has got a population of 40. He figures as long as he keeps sending good men after bad, sooner or later, the basic law of mathematics means he'll win.
I want to come on to how well equipped both sides are going into the winter months. The UN reports now that Iran is sending glide bombs to Russia. How will they be used on the front line?
Well, glide bombs are just, cruise, a cheap cruise missile, in essence. So used to target Ukrainian infrastructure. They've got a good range and a good loiter time, but they can be shot down. And Ukraine recently received more Gepard anti-aircraft systems, 35 millimeter, which have proved highly effective as an air defense capability. So there was a recent attack, and I believe 172 Shahed loitering munitions were launched, and of those, about 90% were shot down, which is a great result.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the Shahed drones because, of course, Iran supplying weapons to Russia is nothing new. I think the Shahed drones have been in use on the front line for about a year or so now. But do you get the sense that there is a growing military alliance now between Iran and Russia?
Yes, I think so. And when you look at events in Gaza, it's very easy to see Iran and Russia's hands behind that. Russian weapons, Russian training even, and Iran supporting all its proxies, so Hezbollah as well as Hamas, and getting them jazzed up to have a go at Israel as well. But I think they've been warned off by the Americans, just keep out of it or else. So yes, a strong alliance between Russia and Iran, and I think Iran needs to be very careful. Otherwise, it could find its oil supplies suffering.
And on the flip side, Nicholas, if you're Ukraine, if you're President Zelensky, what weaponry do you need now?
Well, he needs the aircraft that I discussed earlier, and we know that's coming, but we just have to make sure that not only does he have enough aircraft, but also enough munitions to hang off those aircraft to take the fight to the Russians. But in particular, next year, he is going to need tanks and infantry carriers and fighting vehicles to actually penetrate Russian defences and take back lost ground. And they have to be able to do that. They literally have to physically dispossess Russian forces of the ground that they are currently occupying. And that's very tough. It'll be done with artillery, of course, aircraft and tanks, all conducting combined arms maneuver. A big debate as the war has raged is the tank obsolete? And really, that question is like saying, are armoured vehicles obsolete? And of course, we know they're not, because the threat posed by artillery and cruise missiles and aerial threats coming in for troops on the ground means that you absolutely have to travel around the battlefield with protected mobility. So those kind of vehicles are terribly important and are urgently needed by Ukraine. And we must do everything possible to provide them with more vehicles.
It is an interesting question, though, from a sort of military tactics point of view about the future of the main battle tank. I mean, how long do you think in warfare, I mean, clearly very important right now on the front line in Ukraine, but how long do you think in warfare the main battle tank will keep its current significance?
Well, two things to say about that. I think for sure the battle tank has this enduring role in combined arms maneuver. If you want to conduct a deliberate assault against a defended position, you need heavy armor, and you need the tank and you need the infantry fighting vehicle, and they complement each other. The problem is that the tank has become very vulnerable to anti-tank missiles and to drones and things like that, and therefore tanks need active protection systems that can take out these threats, and that actually could sort of level the playing field. And we've seen APS used very effectively by Israel in Gaza when they've been attacked by anti-tank weapons. And we're developing much more sophisticated APS systems now that will go on tanks. What this means is, though, that tanks have become much more expensive, which limits the number that we can afford. So what this really means is that the tank has become a specialist weapon. So you're not going to have everybody traveling around in tanks. You will use them in those specific moments when you need to retake lost ground. For the most part, you'll have troops in vehicles like Boxer 8x8s or 4x4 MRAPs moving around in volume, dispersed, so that they can avoid and hopefully mitigate aerial attacks. So that's what I think is going to happen.
Is there a parallel there almost, Nicholas, with UAVs? Because at the start of the war, there was a lot of talk around the fact that Russia had some very expensive UAVs, but it was reluctant to use them because of the cost, whereas Ukraine was having some success using essentially commercial drones that they'd adapted somewhat. Is there almost a parallel to be drawn there?
Yeah. So I think the low-cost military drone is definitely going to become a thing. And because to a certain extent, we've been able to stop drones using electronic warfare techniques that jam them and lasers that take them down. But we're seeing better quality military drones now, certainly from the West, and I think they will continue to play a vital role. And so, they're very good for reconnaissance. They're very good for sort of loitering munition effect. So a huge game changer, really. The democratization of a drone, if you like. And that is, it allows everybody to have affordable air power. And that's a big change in my book.
How straightforward are they to produce these low-cost drones? I know in Russia they've massively upped their production of them. I think they've converted a disused shopping mall into a massive drone production centre. Are they difficult to manufacture?
Well, yeah, they require semiconductors like anything else because the flight characteristics are computer controlled, and they have to be sort of finely tuned. So it's a sophisticated electronic equipment. So they are. They're complex. They're not as straightforward as you might think. But once you've designed something and you know what parts go into it, actually you can mass produce them quite easily. So it's definitely something that will continue to be produced in quantity without too much trouble.
We'll come back to the very latest on the front line in Ukraine in a moment. Just on this wider discussion about the future of warfare, what about the future of light infantry units?
Well, I don't think that light infantry can travel around on foot or in open-top vehicles. I can see special forces doing that, where they're operating in groups of less than 12, where they just go around in something like a Polaris M-Razor, and that's fine, dropped in by helicopter and away they go. But where you're talking about a light infantry battalion, they will have to go around in some form of protected mobility. That is the new rule of warfare. And we have to accept that. The British Army is using Jackal in Estonia. Beside the sort of the cruel weather effect on soldiers on the ground, that vehicle is very effective in a desert situation, a long range patrol. But it is not an MRAP, and you really do need to protect the guys moving from A to B because of that threat of artillery.
Just going back to the front line, I want to ask you about Russia's ongoing attempts to encircle Avdiivka and indeed capture Avdiivka. They've had no success so far.
Mm.
And it seems to me, I understand the symbolic importance of taking any piece of territory. I understand its strategic significance in terms of being very close to Donetsk, but it doesn't appear as if Russia has had any success so far and will have any success over the winter months. So why are they expending so many resources on it?
It's almost become symbolic. It almost reminds me of sort of a First World War campaign where generals were throwing, battalion after battalion to take, unimportant hamlets, because it was felt that if that one objective was achieved, everything else would fall into place, and it was it was a fool's errand, and I believe in this case it's the same principles apply. So. Ukraine understands how important it is to Russia. All they have to do is stand back and just blast it with artillery, and they're inflicting huge casualties on Russia as a result. And I'm not surprised that people are complaining about Russian tactics, because why would you allow yourself to be thrown into this pointless battle that's not going to achieve anything in the widest sense of things? So that frustration must be complete.
And you would see it in those terms. You think Russia targeting Avdiivka to the extent they are is pointless?
Yes, yeah, I do. It's not going to open a gate for them. It's just them trying to say, oh, look, we're still on the offensive, we're still moving forward, and Ukraine is not. That's not the case. And, when you look at the war in the whole scheme of things, it really has ground to a halt. It's a stalemate again, and it will be until next spring. Despite occasional small activities behind the lines or drone attacks.
And there has been growing criticism as well from people like Russian military bloggers about the Kremlin's lack of stated war aims at the moment. Do you think in part that's because, frankly, if they were honest, their war aims are just to hold the territory they have? They probably quite like the stalemate they're in at the moment.
Yeah, for Russia, victory is not being kicked out of Ukraine, and the longer they stay there, the more they believe that they will erode Western support for Ukraine. And of course, that's not the case. I mean, people say, Western support is dying down. That's not the case. We are all invested in the long term in supporting Ukraine and making sure it wins. And I hope any Ukrainians watching this will take that message on board. We are here for the long term. We will not desert Ukraine, because if we do, we are next. And I think just another point to emphasize here, Putin, really is a modern Hitler. He's a personification of evil that I haven't seen since the Second World War. It's cast in the same mold as Stalin. The number of his own people that he's killed. This is a monster of epic proportions. And I can't believe that we have someone like this leading a major country in this day and age. And this man has to go one way or another. And I think he will go. And I think the thing to make him go is to ensure Ukrainian victory. So absolutely the West has to go on supporting Ukraine until Russia pulls out or Putin is forced out by his own people.
On that note, what did you make of the NATO foreign ministers summit this week? They were obviously meeting to discuss the latest regarding Ukraine.
Well, I think they will be thinking very carefully about what further aid they need to provide. And I hope that the one thing that they will have discussed is the need for more armoured vehicles, artillery systems and ammunition. And of course, it's not just about the systems. It is about the logistics and the ammunition. And let's not forget, this war is being won by capability, but it's mostly been won by logistics, keeping the Ukraine forces resupplied, making sure that their injured troops are evacuated and treated. And that care and attention to things like that has been a huge factor in sustaining the Ukrainian army as a whole, so that they remain motivated and capable of achieving their aims.
There clearly is a huge amount of solidarity and support still for Ukraine among Western countries. And I appreciate what you said about the difficulty in making any kind of breakthrough over the winter months because of the ground conditions on the front line. But surely if the West were really serious about wrapping up this conflict and moving to an endgame, they could increase supplies yet further to Ukraine, which would be in the interest, frankly, of President Biden, who needs a political victory between now and the election and will be worried about what may happen to support for Ukraine were Trump to take over the White House again. For Rishi Sunak going into his election, it would be in his interest to have a political victory. Do you struggle to understand why they're not doing even more to support Ukraine?
No, I don't struggle. I think there's a very good reason, and that is that Russia has nuclear weapons. And what we don't want to do is to escalate too much too quickly to the point where Putin can appeal to his own people saying we are under direct attack by the West. Look what they've done. We need to go to nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction, using chemical weapons on the ground, which might trigger again a nuclear response. So I think we do have to be mindful that desperate men do desperate things. So it's a question of keeping up this constant pressure so that there's never an overt justification for him to escalate. It's like boiling the frog gently rather than throwing it in boiling water. That's how you cook him.
So it's a really difficult balancing act, I suppose, between allowing him to lose slowly in a way that doesn't completely humiliate him, and yet not so slowly that you risk losing Western support.
Yeah, no, that's right. It is a fine balance. But I think as time goes on, support for what Putin is doing is dying within Russia. I think a lot of what, before this war started, I knew a lot of Russians living in London. They're desperate about Putin. They absolutely detest him and can't wait for him to go. I just wish we were doing more at a government level to engage with the oligarchs who are now living in Dubai. There's a lot of them there. They're powerful and influential within Russia. I wish we hadn't kicked Abramovich out of the UK because he's proved to be a kingmaker in Russia. He was close to Putin. I think if we treated him a bit better, perhaps we could have got a negotiated settlement that would ultimately pave the way for a more pro-Western government in Moscow. And I think so. Another point to make here is that a lot of ordinary Russian people have suffered enormously because of what Putin has done to them, their families, and to their children who've been deployed there, who did not want this war, who did not agree with it, and they've been silenced. So, once this war is over, we will have to engage with Russia again. And that's very important because Russia is going to be a key trading partner for Europe in the future.
And on the increasing desperation of Putin, particularly in terms of who he is recruiting to fight on the front line, Russian media has reported that Putin has pardoned 2 convicted cannibals because they fought in his war. What do you make of that, Nicholas?
Desperate people do desperate things. I don't know how. Maybe that's just a propaganda, tool. I don't really sort of pay it much credence, but it's just it's a curiosity more than anything.
I mean, it does beg the wider question, though, about who is fighting now on the front line for Russia. I mean, where do most of their recruits currently come from?
Yeah, well, they're forced conscripts. They're very, very young kids, barely out of their teens. They're people from prisons, people from the eastern states that belong to Russia, who are badly trained and badly equipped. They're not as well equipped as the Ukrainian forces. And what really worries me for Russian forces now operating in winter, the quality of winter clothing and accommodation and all the things that support troops on the ground in extreme weather, the Russians just don't have that. Ukrainians do, because they're getting those things from us, as well as the weapons.
We've also had reported this week that the wife of Ukraine's head of military intelligence has been poisoned. If, as suspected, this came from Russia, are you surprised by this? Are you not surprised by this? And on one level, are you surprised that Russia hasn't tried these tactics more already?
Not surprised by this at all. We know Russia has been doing this all along. It's tried to assassinate Zelensky multiple times. I think Zelensky said, the first time was a bit scary, but then, you just get used to it. And so, being a Russian agent operating in Ukraine now is extremely difficult. They're onto these people very quickly. And so they'll be looking to find who the culprits are these and punishing them severely when they find them. So they will obviously it's straight out of Putin's playbook, and they will continue to do that.
And just finally, Nicholas, we have a lot of Ukrainians who watch Frontline on Times Radio's YouTube channel. For those of them watching this, what would your message be?
Keep going. Churchill said, when you're going through hell, keep going. And there will be an end to this, and you will emerge victorious. And we cannot afford in the West to let you lose. We are behind you, and we will support you every step of the way. And we may not always be visible in our presence in what we're saying in public through the media, but actually there is a very serious government commitment. And that's certainly true of the United Kingdom, of Germany, of France, and other NATO members within Europe, and in particular, the United States. I mean, America has been amazing and will continue to support Ukraine. And of course, on that, don't be worried about Trump. I don't think he's going to be elected. I don't think he can be elected. And I think sanity will prevail in America, and America will continue to support Ukraine.
Nicholas, as ever, thank you for joining us on Frontline.
Pleasure.
Thank you for watching this episode of Frontline for Times Radio. For more on the war in Ukraine, subscribe to the Times Radio YouTube channel. Listen to Times Radio on your digital radio, or you can read the Times online with your digital subscription or in print. Thank you and goodbye.